Under glittering chandeliers, laughter echoed, but not the kind that warms the soul. Guests whispered, ridiculed, and sneered at the pregnant waitress struggling to balance trays and tears. What no one knew was that her husband, the host, the billionaire everyone feared, was about to turn their laughter into silence. Under the soft glow of golden chandeliers, the Grand Meridian Hotel pulsed with wealth and pride. Laughter floated through the air, like bubbles from the champagne glasses, blending with the distant hum of an orchestra, playing something elegant, something expensive. Everyone was dressed to be noticed, to be envied. Diamonds winked from manicured fingers, and whispered conversations carried the kind of cruelty only privilege could make sound polite. Through this glittering chaos moved Evelyn. Her uniform, freshly pressed but slightly too tight around her growing belly, contrasted sharply with the designer gowns around her. The black apron tied across her waist couldn't hide the gentle curve of motherhood, a detail that drew more attention than the trays she carried. Every step she took was measured, graceful despite the weight she bore, both physical and emotional. She had worked in places like this before, back when her smile was more than a mask and her dreams didn't taste like exhaustion. Tonight she wasn't here to mingle, to shine, or to be admired. She was here to serve, to glide unnoticed between tables and make sure the rich stayed comfortable. But people like Evelyn were never truly invisible. The cruel ones always found a reason to look. "Careful, sweetheart," a blonde woman in a sequined dress called out as Evelyn passed. "Wouldn't want to spill anything on that precious belly of yours. Who knows who the father even is?" The women around her laughed. Brittle, false laughter, but loud enough to sting. Evelyn's hands tightened on the tray, her knuckles whitening as she forced a polite smile. She didn't look at them. She had learned long ago that silence often disarmed more than words. The head hostess, a woman named Clarissa, noticed the exchange and smiled with smug delight. "Evelyn," she said sweetly, but her tone sliced like glass, "do keep to the back areas. The guests shouldn't be distracted by personal circumstances." Evelyn bowed her head, the words catching in her throat. "Yes, ma'am," she murmured softly. The room spun a little as she turned away, her back aching from the long hours and the weight she carried. But she kept walking. At the far end of the ballroom, near the marble staircase, a man in a tailored black suit watched her. His gaze wasn't mocking. It was protective, restrained. The kind of look that came from knowing her far too well. He didn't approach, not yet. He knew Evelyn's pride too deeply for that, but there was a storm behind his calm eyes, one that would eventually make itself known. Evelyn disappeared through the gilded doors into the kitchen, the noise of laughter muffled behind her. For a brief second, she leaned against the counter, closing her eyes. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give them that. Instead, she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and picked up another tray. Back inside, the party glowed brighter than ever. But for all its light, the shadows were only growing longer. The night dragged on, and with each passing hour, Evelyn felt the weight of both her unborn child and the cruelty around her pressing harder against her chest. The laughter from the ballroom seemed to swell and echo off every surface, sharp and cold, like the sound of clinking crystal turned into mockery. She moved quietly, careful not to draw attention, but in places like this, kindness was weakness and silence an invitation. As she placed a tray of hors d'oeuvres on a mirrored table, two women nearby leaned closer, pretending to whisper but ensuring their words carried. "Can you imagine," one said with an amused smirk, "showing up to serve food while pregnant? How desperate do you have to be?" The other chuckled, sipping champagne. "Probably thinks it's noble. Poor thing. Doesn't she know these events aren't charity?" Evelyn's throat tightened, but she kept her eyes down, retreating with slow, steady steps. Her mother had once told her that dignity isn't something anyone can take. It's something you give away when you let bitterness win. But tonight, those words were hard to hold on to. Each snide remark, each stare, chipped away at her resolve like wind against stone. She slipped back into the kitchen for a moment's peace. The heat of the stoves and the smell of roasted duck felt more comforting than the stifling perfection outside. She set the empty tray on the counter and rubbed her aching lower back, staring at her reflection in a steel refrigerator door. The tired eyes staring back weren't the woman she remembered, not the ambitious event designer who used to dream of opening her own firm, not the woman who once commanded rooms like this. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "You all right, Evelyn?" It was Marta, one of the older waitresses who'd seen her share of long nights and cruel faces. Evelyn managed a weak smile. "Just tired. These heels weren't made for 9 hours." Marta chuckled softly and handed her a bottle of water. "You've got more grace than all of them put together. Don't let them forget it." But when Evelyn returned to the floor, the whispers had grown bolder. One man nudged his friend and gestured toward her. "Can you believe they let her work here like that? It's bad for the image." His words sank into her skin like frost. The orchestra played louder, as if to drown out the malice, but Evelyn could still hear every syllable. Her hands trembled slightly as she carried another tray. She told herself she'd only last until midnight. Just a few more hours. Just a few more cruel stares to endure. Somewhere across the ballroom, the man in the tailored suit, the same one who had watched her earlier, turned his head, his jaw tightening. He had seen enough, but for now he stayed silent, letting the world expose itself first. When Evelyn finally made her way toward the far corner to gather empty glasses, she felt something shift inside her. Not anger, but resolve. The cruelty around her no longer pierced her the same way. It only made her stronger, steadier. They thought they were watching a waitress crumble, but what they didn't know was that they were witnessing the quiet rise of a woman who would soon bring their arrogance to its knees. The laughter from the ballroom drifted faintly through the heavy kitchen doors, but Evelyn barely heard it anymore. Her mind wandered, back to a time when she wasn't serving trays but sketching floor plans for them. The same hotel, the same chandeliers, the same glittering crowd. Yet everything felt different now. Once she had designed these galas. Now she was serving them. Months before, she'd been the rising star of Grant and Company. Events known for transforming ordinary rooms into dreamscapes of light and art. Her name had begun appearing in magazines, her ideas praised by clients who saw her as a visionary. But the moment she announced her pregnancy, all of that changed. Meetings she once led became ones she wasn't invited to. Projects she'd nurtured were quietly reassigned. And one morning, with a polite smile and a carefully worded letter, they told her the company was restructuring. She was out, discarded like an old menu after the meal. Now, as she balanced champagne flutes on her tray, she recognized the faces of her former colleagues across the room, laughing, networking, pretending not to know her. The same people who'd congratulated her for her engagement last year were now pretending she was invisible. Evelyn turned slightly, her eyes settling on the man seated near the front, the one who had watched her all evening. Daniel Grant. The guest knew him as the powerful billionaire philanthropist hosting the night's charity gala. No one in this room knew that he was also her husband. Their love story wasn't born of money or glamour. Daniel had met Evelyn years ago when he was just beginning to rebuild his family's business after his father's passing. She'd been working on a design project for one of his hotels, her creativity breathing new life into his struggling brand. What started as professional admiration had turned into something deeper, something real. Two people who believed in each other when no one else did. But Daniel had his own battles. In the ruthless world of high society, power was fragile. He learned that love, if revealed at the wrong time, could be used as a weapon. When Evelyn became pregnant, Daniel begged her to keep their marriage private a little longer, just until he finalized a major acquisition deal. Evelyn had reluctantly agreed, trusting his judgment. She didn't expect the decision would leave her alone in a world that judged her for everything she wasn't allowed to explain. And so she kept her silence. Even tonight, surrounded by the same people who once dismissed her, she never revealed who she truly was. She didn't want Daniel's protection to become her shield. She wanted her dignity and her choice. But Daniel's patience was wearing thin. From his seat, he watched as Clarissa, the head hostess, leaned toward Evelyn and whispered something cruel, her expression smug. Evelyn simply nodded, turned, and walked away, her back straight despite the sting. Daniel's hand clenched into a fist beneath the table. He had promised to wait, to let the night unfold naturally, to reveal the truth when it mattered most. But watching his wife, the woman who had built so much of this world with her bare hands, endure humiliation she didn't deserve, made something inside him ache with fury. A guest beside him laughed loudly. Quite the entertainment, isn't she? The pregnant waitress adds a bit of drama to the evening. Daniel's jaw tightened. Yes, he replied evenly, his eyes fixed on Evelyn as she disappeared into the hallway. But sometimes drama is what makes people remember a night forever. He rose quietly, unnoticed amid the laughter and music. Outside, Evelyn was catching her breath near a service corridor, unaware that the storm she'd been holding back all night was about to shift. The people who mocked her were about to learn that they hadn't been laughing at a waitress. They'd been mocking the woman who owned the very company hosting their glittering little world. And Daniel Grant, calm, composed, and infinitely patient, was done staying silent. The night had reached its glittering peak. The chandeliers shimmered brighter, and the orchestra swelled with a crescendo of violins. Champagne flowed, laughter echoed, and under it all, Evelyn moved like a ghost through her own past. Every polished marble tile, every gilded column, every laugh that brushed against her ears. It all belonged to a world she had once helped build but could no longer touch. Clarissa, the head hostess, watched her from across the room, her smile sharp and artificial. There was something in Evelyn's quiet endurance that unsettled her. That soft grace that refused to break, even under ridicule. So she decided to push harder. "You missed a glass there," Clarissa said loudly, gesturing toward the corner of a table. "Honestly, Evelyn, you're slower every hour. Do try not to fall asleep on your feet." Laughter rippled through a nearby cluster of guests, and Evelyn nodded, forcing a tight smile. Her body ached. Her ankles throbbed. Every movement felt heavier, her balance uncertain. Still, she gathered the courage that had carried her this far and stepped toward the table. But fate, or perhaps malice, waited in small, cruel gestures. As Evelyn reached for the glass, Clarissa accidentally bumped into her shoulder. The tray in Evelyn's hands tilted, and the room seemed to move in slow motion as crystal glasses tumbled, shattering against the marble floor. The laughter that followed wasn't just mockery. It was brutal, gleeful. Gasps mixed with murmurs, and someone snickered. "Oh dear, she's clumsy and careless." Poor thing Evelyn knelt down immediately, trembling, her knees pressing against the cold floor as she began picking up shards of glass. Her hands shook, but not from fear. From humiliation too sharp to swallow. One shard nicked her finger. A tiny line of blood bloomed, crimson against pale skin. She stared at it for a moment, frozen. The room blurred. Laughter, whispers, the metallic scent of blood. And suddenly she felt the weight of every moment she'd endured. Every insult, every condescending smile, every door slammed in her face. Clarissa crouched beside her, whispering so only Evelyn could hear. "You're lucky I even let you in here. You don't belong in this world anymore." Evelyn looked up slowly. For a moment their eyes met. Calm, meeting cruelty. "You're right," Evelyn said softly, her voice barely more than a breath. "But you'll regret saying that." Before Clarissa could reply, the sound of a microphone crackling filled the room. The music faded. A hush fell as Daniel Grant rose from his table and stepped onto the stage. His presence commanded silence without effort, tall, composed, and radiating authority. The crowd straightened, assuming another speech about charity was coming. But the look on his face silenced even the boldest. "Good evening," he began, his tone cool and even. "I hope everyone is enjoying themselves." He paused, scanning the crowd, his gaze deliberate, heavy, landing briefly on Clarissa and then on Evelyn, who was still kneeling. "Before we continue, I want to share something. A truth that's been hidden far too long." The murmurs began, curious, uneasy. Evelyn froze, her heartbeat quickening. Daniel's eyes softened for a moment as they met hers, silently asking for permission. She didn't nod, but she didn't stop him either. "This gala," he said, his voice steady, "wasn't just organized by my company. It was designed, created, and envisioned by a woman. A woman many of you have dismissed tonight without realizing who she is." He gestured toward Evelyn. That woman is my wife. A stunned silence fell over the ballroom. The air seemed to collapse in on itself. Clarissa's face drained of color, and a glass slipped from someone's hand, shattering in the distance. Daniel continued, his voice rising with restrained fury. While you laughed, she served you. While you whispered, she built the very company that paid for your drinks, your gowns, your little titles. His gaze swept the crowd, unflinching. And while you looked down on her, she showed more grace than any of you ever could. Evelyn rose slowly, her trembling replaced by a quiet strength. The crowd parted as she stood beside him, her chin lifted, eyes bright with unshed tears. For the first time that evening, she wasn't the waitress. She was the woman behind the empire, the one they had tried to break. The night had changed. The laughter was gone. All that remained was silence, and the sound of power reclaiming its voice. For a moment, the ballroom stood frozen, suspended between disbelief and guilt. The chandeliers still glimmered. The orchestra's instruments still gleamed under the lights, but no one dared move. Evelyn stood beside Daniel, her face pale but steady, her fingers curled protectively against the small curve of her stomach. Every mocking whisper from earlier now echoed in the minds of those who had laughed at her. Daniel's voice carried easily, clear and cutting through the hush. Some of you may remember Evelyn, he began, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. She was one of our brightest designers, the creative soul behind the events that made this company thrive. But when she announced her pregnancy, some of you saw that as a weakness. You decided her worth had an expiration date. The weight of his words pressed heavily on the room. No one dared to look at Evelyn, though she could feel the heat of 100 eyes flickering toward her. Clarissa tried to shrink into the crowd, her confidence shattered, but Daniel's gaze found her like a spotlight. And to those who thought they could belittle her tonight, he continued, I want you to remember this moment, because every single one of you who mocked her, you were laughing at my wife. Gasps rippled through the audience. A few guests exchanged horrified glances, realizing how quickly their cruelty had turned to shame. Others fidgeted with their glasses, pretending to study the floor. But Daniel wasn't finished. He stepped closer to Evelyn, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Not possessive, but proud. She chose silence out of strength, he said softly. She could have told you who she was. She could have embarrassed you publicly, but she didn't, because she believes in dignity more than power. Grace more than revenge, Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes shimmering. For months she had carried the weight of hiding, of pretending to be less than she was. Now standing beside him, she felt something uncoil inside. Freedom. Daniel turned back to the crowd. This gala was meant to raise money for women's empowerment. Yet tonight, some of you showed exactly why it's still needed. So I'm making an announcement. From this moment on, every dollar raised here, and every dollar I personally match, will go to the Evelyn Foundation, an organization supporting single mothers, pregnant women, and anyone who has been told they don't belong in the world of success. The crowd broke into scattered applause, hesitant at first, then genuine. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes. The story of the evening had shifted entirely. What had begun as gossip had become history. Daniel handed the microphone to Evelyn. The room held its breath. She looked around, her voice calm but firm. I don't hold anger toward anyone, she said, because I've learned something. No one can define your worth unless you hand them the power to. Tonight, I'm taking mine back. The applause grew thunderous. Daniel slipped an arm around her as they walked off the stage together, the same guests who had laughed at her now clapping in awe. The music began again, softer this time, not to celebrate wealth, but redemption. The gala that had begun as a stage for cruelty had just become a lesson in grace. And as the doors closed behind Evelyn and Daniel, everyone in that ballroom knew they'd never forget the night the waitress became the woman they wished they could be. The aftermath of Daniel's revelation rippled through the ballroom like a quiet earthquake. No one dared to resume their laughter. The air was thick with shame, the kind that seeps into every corner and leaves a sting long after the words have faded. The same people who had mocked Evelyn now stood stiffly, their smiles trembling, their confidence stripped away. Clarissa, the head hostess who had tripped Evelyn and whispered poison all night, was pale as marble. She tried to edge toward the exit, but Daniel's voice caught her mid-step. "Clarissa," he said calmly. "A word, please." The crowd parted for her like water around a sinking ship. Her shoes clicked nervously against the floor as she approached him, her face frozen in a rehearsed expression of regret. "I want to apologize," she began, but Daniel's raised hand stopped her. "You should apologize to her," he said, gesturing to Evelyn. Clarissa's lips trembled. I didn't mean to." Evelyn met her eyes, calm and unflinching. "You did," she said softly, her voice stronger than anger. "But I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." The words hung in the air, sharp and merciful all at once. Clarissa's mask cracked, her eyes welled, and she turned away, humiliated. By morning, her name would be removed from every staff list. Across the room, the two women who had mocked Evelyn earlier stood with flushed faces, trying to melt into the wallpaper. One of them forced a shaky smile. "Mrs. Grant, we had no idea." Evelyn simply replied, "You shouldn't need to know someone's name to treat them with kindness." It was a quiet sentence, but it landed heavier than any insult ever could. Reporters began murmuring, cameras flashing to capture every detail of the scene. Within hours, the story would flood social media. Billionaire defends his pregnant wife at charity gala. Influencers who had laughed at her earlier now typed messages of support, desperate to rewrite their guilt into sympathy. But Evelyn didn't care for any of it. Her piece wasn't about the headlines. As she and Daniel walked out of the ballroom together, whispers trailed behind them. Not of judgment this time, but of awe. The same hall that once echoed with laughter now held reverence. And behind them, the people who had mocked her were left standing in the ruins of their own arrogance, realizing too late that the woman they'd tried to break had just taught them what grace truly looked like. Weeks later, the story of that night still lingered like a legend. News outlets called it the Gala of Grace, and Evelyn's foundation, the Evelyn Fund for Women, had already opened its first branch downtown. Every morning she arrived early, greeting young mothers and expectant women who came seeking help. Her laughter, once quiet and hidden, now filled rooms that smelled of hope instead of perfume. Daniel often visited in the afternoons, carrying her favorite coffee and lingering just to watch her work. "You built this," he'd say softly, pride glimmering in his eyes, and she'd smile, touching her belly. "We built this." Those who had mocked her tried to reach out, apologies, invitations, even donations. But Evelyn no longer needed validation. Her peace didn't come from their regret. It came from knowing she had turned humiliation into purpose. On the evening before her child's birth, she stood by the window of their home, city lights flickering like stars below. The world that once laughed at her now learned from her, and as she whispered goodnight to the life growing within her, Evelyn smiled, serene, strong, and free. The laughter that once broke her had become her crown. Sometimes the ones who laugh at your struggle end up applauding your strength. If Evelyn's story touched you, hit the like button, share it, and subscribe for more powerful stories that prove kindness and courage will always outshine cruelty.